The lights burned long after midnight, though no celebration echoed through the stone halls. Behind tall windows and heavy curtains, whispers moved more carefully than footsteps. Outside, the towers stood calm against the night sky, ancient and unmoved. Inside, a decision was being made that would never be spoken of openly again. In those rooms, loyalty was measured not in affection, but in silence. Someone would soon choose between truth and survival, and whatever choice was made would not only alter one life, but quietly shape the future of an entire institution. The walls would remember. The people within them would learn to forget. For centuries, this fortress had stood as a symbol of stability, its battlements rising above wars, revolutions, and changing empires. By the late 20th century, it remained one of the most recognizable seats of power in the world, a place where tradition ruled and appearances mattered more than confession. Behind its grand ceremonies and polished rituals lived a family bound by duty and expectation. They were watched, admired, and protected. Yet within these rooms, private grief and private bargains often carried a heavier weight than public crowns. One betrayal, quietly contained within these walls, would teach them all a lesson. Power could be preserved, but never without a cost. And sometimes, the greatest sacrifices were the ones history never recorded aloud. Welcome to Old Money Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world of the richest families in history. If you love exploring historical tales of power, lavish estates, and fierce family rivalries, this channel is for you. If you enjoyed this story and want more riveting historical tales, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon to never miss an update. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world of old money. The modern era of the British monarchy did not begin with confidence or triumph. It began with fear. By the second decade of the 20th century, the old certainties that had sustained royal families across Europe were collapsing with alarming speed. Thrones fell, empires dissolved, and crowns that once seemed eternal were swept away by revolution, war, and public anger. The lesson was clear and deeply unsettling. Birth alone no longer guaranteed survival. In 1917, Britain was at war, and anti-German sentiment ran deep across the country. Air raids, food shortages, and mounting casualties had hardened public opinion. At the center of this unease stood a royal family whose name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, sounded dangerously foreign. Though the monarchy had ruled Britain for generations, its German roots suddenly felt like a liability rather than a lineage. The crown was no longer merely symbolic. It was vulnerable. The decision to change the family's name was not taken lightly. It was an act of strategic self-preservation, born from the understanding that perception could decide fate. In July 1917, King George V issued a proclamation renouncing all German titles and adopting a new name drawn from stone rather than blood: Windsor. The name evoked permanence, history, and Englishness. It tied the family not to distant ancestry, but to a physical place that it stood for centuries. In a single gesture, the monarchy reshaped its identity to align itself more closely with the nation it ruled. This moment marked more than a rebranding. It signaled the beginning of a modern monarchy, one that understood the power of image, symbolism, and public approval. Survival would depend not only on ceremony, but on appearing relatable, loyal, and unmistakably British. Yet this transformation carried an unspoken cost. To preserve the institution, individuality would increasingly be suppressed. Emotion would be managed. Silence would become a duty. The fear driving this change was not abstract. Across the Channel, Europe's royal houses were being dismantled. The execution of the Russian imperial family in 1918 left a lasting psychological scar on Britain's royals. They had witnessed what happened when monarchs lost the confidence or patience of their people. From that point onward, caution became doctrine. Stability mattered more than truth. Unity mattered more than happiness. Windsor Castle, long a royal residence, became more than a home. It was a symbol of endurance, a visible anchor to tradition in an unstable world. Behind its walls, the family began to cultivate a careful balance between accessibility and distance. Public appearances were choreographed. Private lives were guarded. The crown learned to speak selectively and To remain silent when speaking would be dangerous. Children born into this world were raised not for freedom, but for function. From an early age, duty was instilled as a moral obligation rather than a choice. Emotional restraint was praised. Personal desires were expected to yield to public responsibility. The monarchy survived by narrowing the space between the individual and the institution, until the two became nearly indistinguishable. Yet beneath this controlled exterior, tension simmered. The expectations placed upon each generation grew heavier as the world modernized. Newspapers became more aggressive. Photographs traveled faster than proclamations. The monarchy could no longer rely solely on mystique. It had to manage scrutiny. This required disciplined sacrifice. By the 1930s, the House of Windsor appeared secure on the surface. The name had taken hold. The war had been survived. Public loyalty remained strong. But the stability was fragile, dependent on every member playing their assigned role. There was little room for deviation, and none for open defiance. What the family could not yet see was that the very strategy that saved them absolute commitment to image and duty would soon be tested from within. The foundation had been laid for endurance, but also for fracture. A monarchy built on controlled silence could survive scandal, but it would struggle with love, rebellion, and the human need to be seen as more than a symbol. The House of Windsor had secured its future by reinventing itself, but in doing so, it had quietly set the terms of its own conflicts that would unfold not on battlefields, but within families, marriages, and private hearts. The first great test of the House of Windsor did not come from war or revolution, but from within its own ranks. By the mid-1930s, the monarchy had regained a measure of stability. The new name had settled into public consciousness, and the royal family projected an image of discipline and continuity. Yet beneath this carefully maintained surface, the institution remained fragile. Its survival depended not only on public support, but on the personal choices of those who wore the crown. In January 1936, King George V died, and his eldest son ascended the throne. The transition appeared smooth, even reassuring. The new king was modern, charismatic, and widely admired. He moved with confidence among the public and seemed to represent a more approachable monarchy for a changing age. For a brief moment, it appeared that the House of Windsor had entered a new era of popularity and renewed relevance. But the foundations of this optimism were unstable. The new king had already formed a personal attachment that would soon collide with the expectations of his role. The woman at the center of this attachment was not considered suitable for a queen. She was twice divorced, American, and already the subject of quiet concern within court circles. What began as a private matter soon became a constitutional crisis. The monarchy faced an impossible question. Could a king place personal happiness above duty? For centuries, the crown had symbolized continuity and moral authority. To marry against the advice of government and church would risk undermining both. Yet to deny the king's wishes would expose the limits of his personal freedom. The crisis unfolded in whispers at first private meetings, or hand correspondencia in intense consultations between palace and parliament. By December 1936, the situation could no longer be contained. The king chose to abdicate. In a broadcast heard across the nation, he explained that he could not carry the burden of kingship without the support of the woman he loved. His words were measured, but their impact was seismic. The crown passed not to a prepared heir, but to a younger brother who had never expected to rule. The abdication reshaped the House of Windsor overnight. It revealed, with painful clarity, the cost of maintaining the monarchy's image. Personal desire had collided with institutional survival, and the institution had prevailed. The message was unmistakable. The crown demanded absolute sacrifice. No individual, however beloved, could place themselves above it. For the new king, the responsibility was heavy and unexpected. George VI assumed the throne with a sense of duty rather than ambition. He was quieter than his predecessor, more at ease at bed, and acutely aware of his limitations. Yet these qualities, once seen as weaknesses, would soon become sources of strength. He represented steadiness in a time of uncertainty, and the public responded with sympathy and respect. Windsor Castle became a place of renewed focus. It was here that the royal family consolidated its identity, presenting itself as disciplined, united, and devoted to the nation. The scars of the abdication were never openly discussed, but they lingered in private memory. Trust had been shaken. The importance of loyalty to the crown above all else was reinforced. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 provided an opportunity for the monarchy to rebuild its standing. Rather than retreating from danger, the royal family remained in Britain, sharing in the hardships faced by ordinary citizens. Bombing raids, rationing, and uncertainty became part of daily life for everyone, including those within palace walls. The decision to stay, rather than seek safety abroad, strengthened the bond between crown and country. Public appearances during the war were carefully managed, but deeply symbolic. The king and queen visited bombed neighborhoods, hospitals, and factories. They offered reassurance, not through grand speeches, but through presence. The monarchy's role shifted from distant authority to visible solidarity. In these years, the House of Windsor secured a new kind of legitimacy, one rooted in shared endurance. Amid this turmoil, a young princess was quietly preparing for a future. Raised within the disciplined environment shaped by earlier crises, she absorbed the lessons of duty and restraint. She witnessed the consequences of personal choice and the expectations placed upon those born into royal responsibility. Her life, from an early age, was shaped by the understanding that service would come before self. By the early 1950s, the monarchy stood on firmer ground than it had in decades. It had survived scandal, war, and uncertainty. It had adapted its image to suit a modern world while preserving its traditions. The House of Windsor appeared secure, even admired. Yet the cost of this security remained largely unspoken. Every success had been purchased with sacrifice of freedom, of privacy, and sometimes of personal happiness. The abdication had taught the family that love could not be allowed to threaten stability. The war had shown them that visibility could restore trust. Together, these experiences forged a monarchy that prioritized endurance above all else. It would continue to evolve, but always within the boundaries set by its own history. The crown had survived its greatest early tests, but the lessons learned in these years would echo through the decades to come, shaping decisions, relationships, and conflicts in ways no one could yet fully foresee. When the young queen ascended the throne in 1952, the House of Windsor entered a new phase, one defined not only by survival, but by consolidation. The monarchy had endured crises, war, and internal fracture. Now it faced a different challenge: how to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world without surrendering the traditions that justified its existence. The answer would shape the institution for decades and quietly determine the personal lives of those within it. The early years of the new reign were marked by careful optimism. The coronation in 1953 was not merely a ceremonial event. It was a declaration of continuity. Broadcasts on television for the first time, it allowed millions to witness a ritual that had previously been distant and exclusive. This decision to permit cameras into such a sacred moment reflected a subtle but important shift. The monarchy was learning to adapt to modern media, to invite the public closer while still maintaining an aura of mystery. Windsor Castle became both symbol and stage. Its stone walls, steeped in centuries of history, offered reassurance to a nation adjusting to post-war realities. At the same time, its rooms housed a family navigating the pressures of visibility. The institution demanded stability, yet the world outside was growing more restless. Social expectations were evolving. Younger generations questioned hierarchy and tradition. The monarchy had to appear timeless without seeming out of touch. To maintain influence, the crown expanded its presence across the Commonwealth and beyond. Royal tours carried the image of continuity to distant nations, reinforcing bonds forged during empire and war. These journeys were carefully choreographed displays of unity and respect. They strengthened diplomatic relationships and sustained the monarchy's global profile. Yet they also required long separations, rigid schedules, and emotional restraint. Public service came first. Private comfort followed, if at all. Within the family, roles were defined with increasing clarity. Each member represented not only themselves, but the institution as a whole. Public appearances were scrutinized. Personal choices carried political weight. Marriages were expected to reinforce stability and respectability. In this environment, Individuality could exist only within carefully controlled boundaries. The lesson learned from earlier crises remained firmly in place. Personal desire must never threaten public confidence. The castle itself evolved into a center of quiet authority. Official events, diplomatic meetings, and state visits unfolded within its halls. Every gesture was measured, every interaction observed. The monarchy presented itself as both ancient and adaptable, rooted in tradition yet capable of meeting the demands of a modern age. This balance required discipline. It also required silence, especially when tensions arose behind closed doors. By the 1960s and 1970s, the monarchy enjoyed considerable popularity. Public ceremonies drew crowds, and the image of a stable royal family offered comfort in uncertain times. Yet beneath this surface harmony, pressures accumulated. The expectations placed upon younger members grew heavier as media coverage intensified. Newspapers and television began to focus not only on official duties, but on private lives. The line between public interest and personal intrusion blurred. Windsor Castle, once primarily a residence, increasingly served as a refuge from scrutiny. Within its walls, family members sought moments of privacy, though true escape was rare. Conversations were guarded. Disagreements were contained. The institution required unity, or at least the appearance of it. To the outside world, the monarchy remained composed and dependable. Inside, the demands of duty could feel isolating. The expansion of royal influence brought with it a paradox. Greater visibility strengthened the monarchy's relevance, but it also exposed its vulnerabilities. Every misstep risked magnification. Every personal difficulty threatened to become public narrative. The family learned to navigate this environment with caution, aware that perception often mattered more than truth. In this way, the monarchy preserved its authority, but at the cost of emotional openness. The castle stood as a constant witness to these adjustments. Its towers and courtyards symbolized endurance, yet its rooms contained the quiet weight of expectation. Generations grew up within its shadow, shaped by the knowledge that their lives were not entirely their own. Duty defined identity. Loyalty to the crown defined worth. In return, the institution offered security, purpose, and a place in history. As the 20th century progressed, the monarchy's power became less about governance and more about symbolism. Its authority lay in continuity, in the ability to represent stability in a changing world. This symbolic power required careful maintenance. Traditions were preserved. Public rituals were refined. The image of unity remained paramount, even when reality proved more complex. By the late 20th century, the House of Windsor had achieved what earlier generations had sought, a secure place within national life. It was respected, visible, and firmly established. Yet the methods used to secure this position, discipline, restraint, and controlled image also created distance within the family. Emotional expression was often subordinated to public responsibility. Personal struggles were managed privately, sometimes at great cost. The expansion of the monarchy's influence ensured its survival, but it also deepened the tension between individual and institution. Those born into its ranks carried both privilege and burden. They inherited not only titles and estates, but expectations shaped by decades of careful preservation. The castle that symbolized strength also represented confinement. It offered protection, yet demanded sacrifice. As the House of Windsor entered the final decades of the century, its authority appeared secure. The crown had adapted to modern media, expanded its reach, and reinforced its traditions. But beneath the ceremonies and public displays, the seeds of future conflict had been quietly planted. The strategies that ensured survival would one day strain relationships and test loyalties. The monarchy had strengthened its foundations, yet in doing so it had tightened the rules by which its members lived. The castle remained steady, its walls unchanged by time. Inside, however, the balance between duty and personal truth grew increasingly delicate. Power had been consolidated, influence expanded, and legitimacy secured. But the cost of maintaining this equilibrium would soon become impossible to ignore. The first fracture did not arrive as an argument or a scandal. It arrived quietly, disguised as formality. In drawing rooms filled with polite laughter and measured smiles, expectations were exchanged long before emotions were understood. What appeared from the outside To be harmony was in truth a careful performance, one that demanded compliance rather than connection. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the monarchy faced a generational shift. Society was loosening its grip on rigid hierarchy, while the royal household remained anchored to tradition. The future of the crown rested on those being raised within its walls, yet their emotional needs were rarely addressed. Duty was emphasized. Vulnerability was discouraged. This imbalance would shape the rivalries to come. The initial conflict was not between two enemies, but between roles. On one side stood the institution, immovable and disciplined, shaped by decades of crisis management. On the other stood individuals expected to embody it flawlessly, regardless of personal cost. The tension between these forces surfaced most clearly in the matter of succession and marriage areas, where private feeling collided with public expectation. When the heir to the throne came of age, the pressure intensified. He was expected to secure the future of the monarchy, not only through service, but through a suitable match. The search was less about compatibility and more about symbolism. The chosen partner would represent continuity, stability, and moral certainty. Love was considered an advantage, not a requirement. Their early interactions were polite, restrained, and shaped by protocol. Conversations followed familiar patterns. Appearances were carefully staged. To observers, the arrangement seemed promising, almost ideal. Yet beneath the surface, emotional mismatches began to form. One party was deeply shaped by duty and long-standing expectation. The other entered a world defined by silence, hierarchy, and scrutiny. Windsor Castle played a central role in this early tension. It was here that formality overshadowed intimacy, where tradition dictated behavior. For those unfamiliar with its rhythms, the environment could feel isolating. Rules governed speech, movement, even emotional expression. The castle did not encourage openness. It rewarded restraint. The first conflicts were subtle but significant. They appeared in moments of misunderstanding, in unmet expectations, in the quiet realization that personnel needs ranked below institutional priorities. Affection was present, but it struggled to compete with obligation. The monarchy expected adaptation, not negotiation. As the relationship progressed, the imbalance became clearer. One individual carried the weight of generations, trained to suppress personal conflict in service of continuity. The other encountered an institution, unwilling to bend. The clash was not loud, but persistent, a steady pressure that reshaped identity and expectation. Publicly, optimism prevailed. Engagements were announced. Celebrations were planned. The nation embraced the narrative of renewal and romance. Privately, uncertainty grew. The early signs of rivalry were not yet visible as conflict between people, but as a struggle between reality and image. This initial phase set the tone for everything that followed. The monarchy, confident in its traditions, believed that time and duty would resolve any discomfort. It had survived worse. What it underestimated was the emotional toll of expectation and the damage caused when personal truth was repeatedly set aside. The rivalry had begun, not as a battle between two sides, but as a quiet contest between what was required and what was needed. It would soon grow louder, drawing in the press, the public, and the institution itself. But its origins lay here, in polite conversations and unspoken doubts, beneath the enduring shadows of Windsor's walls. What began as quiet discomfort soon hardened into strain. The early optimism that surrounded the new royal marriage could not survive the realities of daily life within the institution. From the outside, the monarchy projected unity and grace. Inside, expectations tightened, and misunderstandings multiplied. The pressure to perform happiness became as demanding as the performance of duty itself. At the center of this escalation stood the heir to the throne, shaped since childhood by discipline and emotional restraint, and his wife, whose warmth and openness quickly drew public affection. The contrast between them was striking. Where one relied on structure and tradition, the other sought connection and reassurance. These differences might have been manageable in another setting. Within the monarchy, they became fault lines. The palace responded to early signs of strain with silence. Difficult conversations were avoided. Emotional needs were reframed as temporary weaknesses. The prevailing belief was that time, responsibility, and routine would resolve any tension. This belief had guided the House of Windsor through past crises. Yet this situation was different. The world was watching more closely than ever before. Media attention intensified throughout the 1980s. Newspapers and television followed every public appearance, every gesture, every expression. What had once been private became subject to interpretation and speculation. The royal couple's differences, subtle at first, were magnified by constant scrutiny. Smiles were analyzed. Absences were noted. Silence became suspicious. Within Windsor Castle, the atmosphere grew increasingly constrained. The castle's routines, once a source of stability, now felt suffocating to those struggling within them. Private conversations were limited by fear of exposure. Trust eroded as leaks became more frequent. The institution closed ranks, prioritizing its reputation over individual well-being. The imbalance of power within the marriage deepened the tension. One partner represented continuity, inheritance, and inevitability. The other, despite public popularity, remained an outsider to the inner workings of the crown. Decisions were made without consultation. Support was offered selectively. Emotional vulnerability was met with formality rather than empathy. As public adoration for the princess grew, so too did resentment within royal circles. Her ease with people, her visible compassion, and her willingness to break from tradition unsettled those who believed restraint was essential to authority. What the public celebrated, the institution regarded with caution. The gap between perception and reality widened. By the late 1980s, the rivalry was no longer only emotional. It had become ideological. One side embodied tradition and endurance, believing that personal sacrifice was the price of stability. The other challenged this assumption, intentionally or not, by revealing the human cost of such sacrifice. Their conflict exposed a deeper question. Could the monarchy modernize without losing control of its narrative? The strain reached a turning point as private frustrations found their way into public view. Leaked information, unauthorized recordings, and unnamed sources fed a growing appetite for scandal. Each revelation chipped away at the monarchy's carefully maintained image. The family that had survived war and abdication now faced a different kind of threat, one rooted in intimacy rather than politics. In 1992, the tension became impossible to contain. That year, later described by Queen Elizabeth II as a time of profound difficulty, saw multiple royal marriages falter. The most symbolic event came in November, when a fire swept through Windsor Castle itself. Though the damage was physical, its meaning was unmistakable. The stronghold of tradition had been breached. Public reaction was mixed. Sympathy existed, but so did criticism. Questions arose about privilege, relevance, and accountability. The monarchy responded with measured statements and controlled appearances. Internally, however, the damage was deeper. The rivalry between personal truth and institutional loyalty had reached a critical stage. The marriage at the center of this conflict could no longer be presented as stable. Separation followed, formal but emotionally charged. What had once been managed privately now unfolded under relentless observation. The crown maintained composure, but the cost was visible in strained relationships and hardened positions. This period marked a decisive escalation. The rivalry had moved beyond quiet dissatisfaction into open fracture. Trust between individuals eroded. Confidence in the institution weakened. Windsor Castle, long a symbol of endurance, now reflected vulnerability. The House of Windsor had faced crises before, and survived by controlling the narrative. This time, control was slipping. The tension between tradition and transparency had become public, and the rivalry it created would soon demand a reckoning far greater than anyone inside the castle anticipated. By the early 1990s, the rivalry within the royal household had moved beyond private tension and into the arena of public perception. It was no longer simply a matter of strained relationships behind closed doors. It had become a battle for legitimacy, sympathy, and narrative control. At stake was not only the future of a marriage, but the credibility of an institution built on the careful management of image. The separation of the royal couple in 1992 signaled a shift that could not be easily reversed. Though framed with formal language and composed statements, the announcement confirmed what the public had already begun to suspect. The image of harmony, once central to the monarchy's appeal, had fractured. What remained was a struggle over how that fracture would be understood. Within Windsor Castle, reactions were measured and restrained. The institution relied on precedent and discretion, believing that time and dignity would restore balance. Yet outside its walls, public sentiment was evolving rapidly. Media outlets, emboldened by years of growing access, filled the void left by official silence. Each new report, each leaked conversation, added layers to a narrative that was no longer controlled solely by the palace. The princess at the center of this conflict found herself navigating a paradox. Publicly adored, she possessed a level of influence that few members of the royal family had ever experienced. Her empathy, visibility, and willingness to engage directly with people created a bond that felt immediate and personal. Crowds gathered wherever she appeared. Cameras followed her movements. Too many. She represented warmth in contrast to an institution perceived as distant. Yet popularity did not equate to acceptance within the inner circle of power. While the public embraced her, the monarchy regarded the growing attention with unease. The institution depended on hierarchy and collective identity. Individual prominence. Especially when it overshadowed the Arposta challenge. The more the public rallied behind her, the more complex her position became. The heir, meanwhile, faced his own battle for status. Raised to embody continuity, he had been trained to accept scrutiny without complaint. Yet the narrative unfolding around him increasingly portrayed him as detached, even unsympathetic. The contrast between his reserved manner and her visible vulnerability created a perception gap that widened with each passing month. The rivalry was no longer confined to private disagreements. It had become a contest for public understanding. Media coverage intensified the conflict. Interviews, biographies, and recorded conversations circulated widely. The public consumed these revelations with fascination and concern. Each disclosure eroded the boundary between personal and institutional. The monarchy, accustomed to controlling its image through ceremony and silence, struggled to respond to a narrative driven by emotion and exposure. Windsor Castle remained a focal point throughout this period. It symbolized continuity, yet also represented the rigidity that many now questioned. Within its halls, discussions centered on preserving dignity and stability. Statements were carefully drafted. Appearances were coordinated, but the pace of public reaction outstripped the measured response of the institution. As the years progressed, the battle for acceptance intensified. The princess sought to redefine her role, focusing on humanitarian work and public engagement. Her efforts drew admiration and reinforced her connection with people beyond palace walls. She demonstrated that influence could exist independently of traditional structures. This independence, while celebrated by many, further complicated her relationship with the monarchy. For the heir, the challenge was equally profound. He remained bound to the expectations of succession, aware that his position required steadiness rather than popularity. The contrast between public sentiment and institutional loyalty created a tension that could not be easily resolved. Each side navigated a different set of expectations, and neither could fully meet the demands placed upon them. By the mid-1990s, the rivalry reached a point where reconciliation seemed increasingly unlikely. The formal divorce in 1996 marked the end of the marriage, but not the end of its implications. The monarchy had to adjust to a new reality, one in which personal narratives carried as much weight as official declarations. The balance between privacy and transparency shifted permanently. Public perception became a central battleground. Supporters of the princess viewed her as a symbol of authenticity and compassion. Supporters of the institution emphasized continuity and duty. The media amplified both perspectives, creating a climate in which every action was interpreted through the lens of conflict. The monarchy, once insulated by tradition, now operated under constant observation. Within Windsor Castle, the emotional impact was significant. Relationships grew strained. Trust became fragile. Conversations were cautious. The rivalry had reshaped not only public narratives, but personal identities. Each participant grappled with the question of how to maintain dignity while confronting a reality that could no longer be concealed. As 1997 approached, the situation remained unresolved. The monarchy had survived the immediate crisis, but the deeper tensions persisted. The battle for status and acceptance had left lasting marks on all involved. Public sympathy, institutional authority, and personal truth remained an uneasy balance. The castle stood as it always had, its towers unchanged. Yet within its walls, the understanding of power had shifted. Authority could no longer rely solely on tradition. It had to engage with a public that demanded authenticity as well as ceremony. The rivalry had exposed the limits of control and the cost of maintaining it. This period would prove to be the threshold of a far greater turning point. The struggle for acceptance had reshaped relationships and expectations. What followed would push the monarchy beyond managed tension into a moment of irreversible change. The rivalry had reached a stage where the next event, unforeseen and devastating, would alter the institution forever. By the summer of 1997, the rivalry that had once simmered within palace walls had settled into an uneasy calm. Officially, the marriage at its center had ended. Publicly, the monarchy presented itself as steady and forward-looking. Yet, beneath this composed exterior, tensions lingered unresolved, unspoken, and increasingly fragile. The institution believed it had weathered the worst. It had not yet realized that the most consequential moment was approaching. The months following the divorce were marked by careful distance. Formal roles had been redefined, but emotional realities remained complicated. The princess, now navigating life outside the immediate structure of royal duty, maintained a global presence. Her humanitarian work continued to attract attention and admiration. Freed from certain constraints, she moved with a new independence. At the same time, she remained tied by history, by motherhood, and by public mimir to the family she had once represented from within. Inside Windsor Castle, the monarchy focused on stability. Engagements were planned. Appearances were scheduled. The rhythm of tradition continued. The castle's routines offered reassurance, a sense that continuity would outlast controversy. Yet there was also a quiet awareness that public sentiment had shifted. The monarchy could no longer assume distance would be interpreted as dignity. Silence, once protective, risked being misunderstood. Media attention did not diminish after the divorce. If anything, it intensified. The princess's movements were followed closely, her personal life scrutinized with relentless curiosity. Each photograph, each rumor, became part of an ongoing narrative. The public remained invested, emotionally and attentively. She had become more than a former royal figure. She was a symbol of vulnerability, resilience, and change. As summer progressed, she spent time abroad, seeking moments of privacy beyond the reach of constant expectation. Yet true privacy proved elusive. The world's interests followed her across borders. Photographers waited. Headlines speculated. Even in apparent escape, the weight of public fascination remained. The monarchy, observing from a distance, maintained its formal composure. Direct interventions seemed neither appropriate nor possible. Within the institution, discussions centered on image and protocol. How close should she remain to official structures? How should appearances be managed? The goal was to preserve stability without reigniting conflict. Windsor Castle, as both residence and symbol, stood at the heart of these considerations. It represented continuity, yet also the distance that had grown between personal experience and institutional expectation. The heirs to the throne spent part of that summer away from the public eye, shielded from the intensity of attention surrounding their parents. Their presence reminded the monarchy of its long-term focus. Continuity through generations, yet their future would inevitably be shaped by the events unfolding in the present. The rivalry between personal truth and institutional control had already left its mark. As August drew to a close, the situation remained unresolved but stable on the surface. There were no major public confrontations, no dramatic announcements. The monarchy appeared to be moving forward, guided by routine and restraint. It was a fragile equilibrium, one that depended on the assumption that time would ease tensions and restore distance. What no one fully anticipated was how quickly that equilibrium could shatter. The stage was set, not through deliberate planning, but through circumstance. The monarchy's reliance on controlled response and measured silence would soon be tested in ways it had not faced before. The coming days would demand decisions made under intense scrutiny, with consequences that could not be reversed. Windsor Castle stood unchanged, its towers rising above the landscape as they had for centuries. Yet within its walls, preparations for ordinary duties continued, unaware that an extraordinary event was imminent. The rivalry that had defined recent years seemed to be fading into history. In reality, it was approaching its most profound turning point. The build-up to that moment was quiet, almost deceptively so. The institution believed it had regained its footing. It trusted in tradition, in protocol, in the resilience that had carried it through past crises. But the next event would not follow precedent. It would demand a response shaped not only by duty, but by empathy and the absence or presence of that empathy would define everything that followed. The moment of confrontation did not unfold within palace walls. It erupted suddenly, far from the castle that had long symbolized stability. In the early hours of the 31st of August, 1997, news began to spread with a speed that no institution could contain. A car crash in Paris. Confusion. Reports shifting from uncertainty to tragedy. Within hours, the world understood that a life deeply intertwined with the monarchy had ended. The shock was immediate and global. Crowds gathered outside royal residencies, not in anger at first, but in disbelief. Flowers appeared in growing numbers. Messages were left against gates and railings. Grief moved faster than official response. The public, already emotionally invested, felt the loss intensely. What had once been a private rivalry now became a public reckoning. Inside royal circles, the reaction was measured, even stunned. The family, gathered away from London, focused first on personal grief and the protection of younger members from overwhelming attention. The instinct to retreat to process events privately was consistent with long-standing tradition. In earlier crises, distance had allowed the monarchy to regain composure before addressing the nation. This time, however, distance created a different perception. As hours passed, the absence of an immediate public statement drew increasing scrutiny. The monarchy's silence, intended as a mark of respect and caution, was interpreted by some as detachment. Media outlets filled the void with speculation. Commentators questioned the institution's ability to respond to a moment defined by emotion rather than protocol. The confrontation between public expectation and royal restraint intensified. Windsor Castle, along with other royal residences, became focal points for public mourning. Crowds continued to gather, leaving tributes and expressing sorrow. The sheer scale of grief was unprecedented. It revealed the depth of connection many felt toward the princess, and it placed the monarchy in a difficult position. How could an institution grounded in tradition respond to a wave of emotion that demanded immediacy and openness? Within the family, discussions unfolded behind closed doors. There was a need to balance private mourning with public duty. The presence of the young princes weighed heavily on every decision. Protecting them from the intensity of media attention was paramount. Yet the broader expectations of the nation could not be ignored. The monarchy had always relied on measured response. Now, the pace of public feeling required something more direct. As they spaced, criticism grew louder. Newspapers carried headlines questioning the institution's silence. Television broadcasts showed the accumulation of flowers and messages outside palace gates. The contrast between public mourning and official restraint became the central narrative. The monarchy faced a confrontation not with a rival family member, but with the expectations of the people it served. The turning point came when the need for a visible response became undeniable. The Queen returned to London. Flags were lowered. Preparations began for a funeral that would draw global attention. Most significant was the decision to address the nation, directly, a rare step that acknowledged the emotional magnitude of the moment. In her televised message, Queen Elizabeth II spoke not only as sovereign, but as a grandmother and public figure. Her words were measured yet personal, reflecting both institutional responsibility and shared grief. The address marked a shift in the monarchy's approach. It recognized that the traditional distance between crown and public had narrowed. The institution could no longer rely solely on formality. It had to demonstrate empathy. The funeral itself became the focal point of this confrontation. Millions watched as the procession moved through London. The presence of family members walking behind the coffin created a powerful, enduring image, one that blended private sorrow with public ritual. The ceremony balanced tradition with adaptation, reflecting the monarchy's attempt to meet the expectations of a changed society. This confrontation was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a moment when the monarchy's established methods collided with a new reality. The institution had to respond to grief that was immediate, personal, and global. It had to reconcile its preference for privacy with the public's demand for visibility. The decisions made in those days would shape its relationship with the nation for years to come. Windsor Castle remained a symbol throughout this period. It represented continuity, yet it also stood as a reminder of the distance that it existed between private experience and public perception. The confrontation forced the monarchy to reconsider how it communicated, how it expressed emotion, and how it balanced duty with empathy. By the time the funeral concluded, the immediate crisis had passed, but the impact remained. The monarchy had faced a moment that challenged its traditions and tested its adaptability. It had responded with caution, then with visible acknowledgement of public feeling. The confrontation had altered the institution's understanding of its role. Silence, once a shield, could no longer be relied upon in the same way. This was the peak of tension, a point at which the rivalry between personal narrative and institutional control reached its most visible form. What followed would not erase the conflict, but it would define its consequences. The monarchy had crossed a threshold from which it could not fully return to its former distance. In the days following the funeral, the immediate wave of public grief began to settle, but the deeper consequences of the confrontation continued to unfold. The monarchy had faced one of the most emotionally charged moments in its modern history. It had responded with visible adaptation, yet the experience left lasting marks on its public image, its internal dynamics, and its understanding of how power must be exercised in a new era. The first consequence was a shift in public expectation. The monarchy could no longer rely solely on tradition and ceremony to maintain its connection with the nation. The events of 1997 had revealed how deeply people felt about those associated with the crown, and how quickly sentiment could turn if empathy appeared absent. The institution recognized that visibility and emotional awareness were no longer optional. They were essential to maintaining legitimacy. Windsor Castle became a place of quiet reflection in the weeks that followed. Its familiar routines resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations within the royal household turned toward lessons learned and adjustments required. The castle's long history had prepared it for crises of war and politics. This crisis, rooted in emotion and perception, demanded a different kind of response. For the Queen, the period was marked by careful reassessment. Her public address had been received as a necessary gesture, one that bridged the gap between tradition and public feeling. Yet it also signaled a recognition that the monarchy needed to communicate more openly. The institution's strength had always been its continuity. Now it had to demonstrate compassion as visibly as it demonstrated stability. The young princes, who had walked behind the funeral procession in a moment witnessed around the world, became central to the monarchy's future. Protecting their privacy while acknowledging public interest required delicate balance. They represented continuity, yet they also embodied the emotional cost of the events. Their experiences would shape the next generation's relationship with duty and visibility. Media coverage, though still intense, began to shift in tone. While scrutiny remained, there was also a sense that the monarchy had entered a period of adjustment. Public conversations about relevance and transparency grew more nuanced. The institution's willingness to adapt, even incrementally, influenced how it was perceived. It was no longer enough to remain distant and dignified. The monarchy had to appear responsive. Internally, relationships within the royal family carried the weight of recent events. Trust had been strained by years of tension and public exposure. The aftermath required not only institutional adaptation, but personal reckoning. Family members navigated grief alongside the need to maintain composure. The rivalry that had defined the previous decade did not disappear, but it evolved into a quieter understanding of shared responsibility. Public ceremonies in the months that followed were carefully managed. Each appearance, each statement, was considered in light of recent experience. The monarchy sought to reaffirm its role as a unifying presence while acknowledging the emotional reality of the nation. Windsor Castle, once primarily a symbol of continuity, now also represented the institution's capacity for reflection and change. The broader impact extended beyond immediate perception. The events of 1997 influenced how the monarchy approached media relations, public engagement, and internal communication. Greater emphasis was placed on responsiveness and accessibility. While tradition remained central, it was increasingly complemented by gestures that signaled awareness of public sentiment. The balance between privacy and visibility shifted, though not without tension. The early 2000s marked a period of cautious rebuilding. Public support, though shaken, stabilized. The monarchy continued its work, drawing on its long-standing role in national life. Yet the lessons of the confrontation lingered. Every decision was shaped by the understanding that image and empathy were inseparable. Authority depended not only on heritage, but on the ability to respond to contemporary expectations. For Windsor Castle, the aftermath reaffirmed its dual role. It remained a residence, a place of family life and official duty. At the same time, it stood as a symbol of endurance through change. Its walls had witnessed moments of triumph and crises alike. The event of 1997 added another layer to its history, one defined by emotional confrontation rather than political upheaval. The monarchy's relationship with the public entered a new phase. There was greater awareness of how quickly narratives could form and how difficult they were to reshape once established. The institution learned to engage more directly, to acknowledge public feeling without surrendering its core traditions. This adjustment did not eliminate tension, but it created a framework for navigating it. The aftermath also revealed the limits of adaptation. While the monarchy could evolve in its public presentation, it remained bound by structure and expectation. Personal lives continued to unfold under scrutiny. The balance between individual identity and institutional role remained delicate. The events of 1997 had shown how quickly that balance could be disrupted and how lasting the consequences could be. Over time, the immediate intensity of the confrontation faded, replaced by a more reflective understanding of its significance. The monarchy had faced a moment that demanded both humility and resilience. It had responded imperfectly but decisively, altering its approach to communication and public engagement. These changes would influence its trajectory for decades. The point of no return had been reached, not in a single decision, but in a series of realizations. The institution understood that it could not return to the distance that once defined it. It had to exist in closer relationship with the public, acknowledging emotion as part of its role. This shift did not erase tradition. It reshaped how tradition was expressed. For those within the royal family, the consequences were both institutional and personal. They carried forward the memory of a period when private conflict became public narrative, and when the response to that narrative shaped the monarchy's future. The experience reinforced the importance of unity, even as it revealed the challenges of maintaining it. As the new century began, the House of Windsor moved forward with a renewed sense of caution and awareness. It continued to perform its duties, to host ceremonies, to represent continuity. Yet beneath these familiar functions lay an understanding that the world had changed. The monarchy could endure, but only by adapting to the expectations of the society it served. Windsor Castle remained at the center of this evolving story. Its towers stood unchanged, but its meaning had deepened. It symbolized not only endurance, but transformation. Within its walls, the monarchy carried forward the lessons of confrontation and aftermath, shaping its future with a blend of tradition and adaptation. The consequences of the events in 1997 would echo for years, influencing decisions, relationships, and public perception. They marked a turning point from which the monarchy could not fully return to its former distance. Instead, it entered a period defined by cautious openness, a recognition that power, to be sustained, must also be understood. In the years that followed the upheaval of the late 20th century, the monarchy entered a period defined less by open conflict and more by quiet recalibration. The dramatic confrontations that once dominated headlines gave way to subtler challenges, questions of relevance, continuity, and identity in a world that no longer granted automatic reverence to inherited authority. The battles ahead would be fought not in public spectacle, but in careful adjustments and internal reflection. Windsor Castle remained the central setting for this new phase. It continued to host state events, private gatherings, and moments of retreat. Its presence symbolized endurance, yet within its walls, there was an increased awareness that endurance required adaptation. The monarchy could not rely solely on its past to secure its future. It had to demonstrate purpose and connection in a rapidly changing society. The early 2000s brought both stability and strain. Public ceremonies resumed their familiar rhythm, reinforcing continuity. Yet each appearance carried an undercurrent of scrutiny shaped by recent history. The institution had learned that silence could be misinterpreted and distance could appear indifferent. Communication, once tightly controlled, became more measured but also more responsive. For the Queen, these years involved balancing tradition with subtle modernization. Her role remained one of consistency and service, yet she also oversaw adjustments in how the monarchy engaged with the public. Greater transparency, carefully managed interviews, and a willingness to acknowledge change marked this period. These were not radical transformations, but they signaled an understanding that the monarchy's authority depended on public trust as much as on heritage. Within the family, the next generation assumed greater visibility. They represented both continuity and renewal. Their public roles were shaped by the lessons of previous decades. Maintain dignity, but appear relatable. Honor tradition, but recognize contemporary expectations. The balance was delicate. Too much distance risked alienation. Too much openness risked overexposure. The castle served as a place where these tensions were considered and managed. Private discussions addressed how to navigate an era of constant media presence and digital communication. The monarchy adapted gradually, embracing certain forms of accessibility while preserving core rituals. The aim was to remain relevant without compromising identity. Despite this cautious progress, challenges persisted. Public debates about the monarchy's role continued. Questions of accountability, cost, and relevance surfaced periodically. Each challenge required response, sometimes through action, sometimes through symbolism. The institution relied on its capacity for continuity, presenting itself as a stabilizing presence amid societal change. Personal struggles within the family occasionally surfaced, reminding observers that the balance between duty and individuality remained complex. While major confrontations were less frequent, the emotional weight of public life did not disappear. Those within the monarchy navigated expectations shaped by both tradition and modern scrutiny. Windsor Castle, though protective in its familiarity, could not fully shield them from external pressures. As the second decade of the 21st century progressed, the monarchy marked significant milestones. Jubilees, commemorations, and national events reinforced its historical role. These occasions highlighted continuity across generations and underscored the enduring presence of the crown. They also offered opportunities to reaffirm connection with the public, blending ceremony with gestures of accessibility. The final years of this period brought a sense of transition. Age and time introduced questions about succession and legacy. The monarchy prepared for an eventual change in leadership. Mindful of how previous transitions had shaped its identity, reflection became more pronounced. The institution looked back on decades of adaptation, recognizing both resilience and vulnerability. Throughout these years, the Queen remained a symbol of stability. Her long reign provided continuity through periods of change. Yet even as she embodied tradition, she oversaw gradual shifts that allowed the monarchy to endure. Her approach reflected an understanding that survival depended on both constancy and flexibility. By 2022, the monarchy stood at the threshold of another transition. The passing of a long-serving sovereign marked the end of an era defined by steadiness and careful adaptation. It also prompted a reflection on what had been preserved and what had changed. Windsor Castle, unchanged in structure, now carried the accumulated memory of decades of transformation. The final battles of this period were not dramatic confrontations, but ongoing efforts to balance tradition with relevance. The monarchy emerged from them with a clearer sense of its role, to represent continuity while acknowledging the realities of a modern world. This balance, though imperfect, allowed it to move forward. The institution had endured scandal, rivalry, and public scrutiny. It had adapted without abandoning its core identity. Windsor Castle remained both a symbol of permanence and a witness to change. The reflection that defined these years laid the groundwork for the monarchy's next chapter, one shaped by legacy, memory, and the enduring question of how power can evolve without losing itself. Long after scandals fade and rivalries quieten, institutions survive through symbols. For the House of Windsor, power was never preserved solely through law or wealth, but through carefully maintained images, places, and rituals that carried meaning across generations. In the aftermath of turmoil, these symbols became even more important. They offered reassurance, continuity, and a sense that the monarchy endured beyond individual lives and private conflict. Windsor Castle stood at the center of this symbolic landscape. Its ancient walls, towers, and courtyards embodied permanence in a world that had changed dramatically since its foundations were laid. For the public, the castle represented history made visible, a reminder that the monarchy had survived wars, revolutions, and internal fracture. For the family itself, it served as both sanctuary and reminder, a place of protection, but also of obligation. Restoration efforts following the 1992 fire had already transformed parts of the castle into a visible statement of resilience. The rebuilding was not merely practical, it was symbolic. Funds were raised, plans debated, and the process was carried out under public scrutiny. When the restored rooms reopened, they communicated a clear message. Damage could be repaired, tradition could be preserved, and the institution would continue. This narrative of recovery echoed strongly after the emotional crisis of the late 1990s. Public ceremonies became another enduring symbol of continuity. Jubilees, anniversaries, and state occasions reinforced the monarchy's place within national life. These events were carefully choreographed, blending centuries-old ritual with subtle modernization. The presence of multiple generations side by side sent a powerful visual message. Despite past turmoil, the line of succession remained intact. These moments mattered because they shaped memory. Public attention moved gradually from conflict to continuity. The monarchy relied on repetition, familiar ceremonies, familiar settings to reassert stability. Each appearance at Windsor Castle, each balcony moment, each procession through historic streets reaffirmed the institution's enduring presence. Beyond architecture and ceremony, traditions themselves acted as living monuments. The language of duty, service, and restraint continued to define royal life. Even as public expectations evolved, these values remained central. They were taught quietly within the family, passed down as both inheritance and instruction. The monarchy's survival depended on maintaining this internal culture as much as its external image. Yet symbols can conceal as much as they reveal. Behind the grandeur of staterooms and the formality of public events lay private truths that rarely entered official history. Windsor Castle, though celebrated as a symbol of unity, had also been the setting for difficult conversations, emotional isolation, and silent compromises. The public narrative focused on endurance. The private experience often involved sacrifice. Memorials added another layer to the monarchy's symbolic world. Moments of collective remembrance, whether formal or informal, allowed the institution to acknowledge loss without revisiting conflict. These acts of remembrance helped integrate painful chapters into a broader story of continuity. They softened the edges of rivalry and reframed loss as part of a shared national experience. The monarchy also relied on names, titles, and traditions that carried historical weight. Name Windsor, adopted in a moment of vulnerability decades earlier, had become synonymous with British identity. It connected the family to place rather than foreign lineage, reinforcing the impression of belonging. This association proved powerful, particularly during times of uncertainty. As the years passed, the monarchy's symbols adapted subtly. Media engagement increased, allowing controlled glimpses into royal life. Carefully curated documentaries, interviews, and public messages offered a sense of accessibility while preserving boundaries. These modern symbols complemented traditional ones, acknowledging a world shaped by immediacy and transparency. Windsor Castle itself evolved into a public monument as much as a private residence. Tourists walked through its halls, learning about history curated through official narrative. The castle told a story of continuity, craftsmanship, and national heritage. Visitors saw restored rooms and historic artifacts, but not the emotional weight those spaces carried for the family who lived there. The contrast between public monument and private reality remained striking. The monarchy's success lay in maintaining that distinction. Symbols were designed to project stability, not vulnerability. They reassured the public that the institution endured, even when individuals struggled. This separation between symbol and self was both strength and burden. Enduring moments also emerged through the next generation. Weddings, births, and public appearances reinforced the narrative of renewal. Each event was framed as a continuation rather than a departure. Windsor Castle often featured prominently in these moments, linking past and present. The message was consistent. The monarchy moved forward, anchored by tradition. At the same time, public memory became selective. The intensity of earlier conflicts softened with time. Symbols replaced stories. Rituals replaced analysis. This process allowed the monarchy to integrate crises into continuity without reopening wounds. The institution understood that survival depended not on erasing history, but on reshaping how it was remembered. Monuments, both physical and symbolic, thus became tools of resolution. They allowed the monarchy to close one chapter while reinforcing the next. Windsor Castle stood not just as a backdrop to history, but as an active participant in shaping narrative and memory. Its presence suggested permanence, even as the meaning of power evolved. The enduring moments of this period were not dramatic confrontations, but carefully managed transitions. Each ceremony, each restored room. Each public appearance contributed to a broader story of resilience. The monarchy did not claim perfection. It claimed continuity, and in doing so, it relied on symbols to carry what words often could not. By the time this phase of legacy took shape, the House of Windsor had reasserted its place in national consciousness. The scars of rivalry and loss remained, but they were woven into a narrative of endurance. Monuments and symbols stood in for difficult truths, allowing the institution to move forward without forgetting entirely. Windsor Castle, unchanged in its foundations, yet altered in meaning, embodied this balance. It remained a fortress of tradition, a public monument, and a private home. Its enduring presence reflected the monarchy's greatest strength and its quietest cost, the ability to survive by turning lived experience into lasting symbol. By the second decade of the 21st century, the monarchy had entered a phase defined less by dramatic upheaval and more by gradual transformation. The institution still stood, still commanded attention, and still represented continuity. Yet the nature of its authority had shifted. It no longer relied on unquestioned reverence. Instead, it depended on relevance, visibility, and the careful management of public trust. Windsor Castle remained central to this evolving identity. Its stone towers and expansive grounds continued to symbolize permanence, but the world surrounding it had changed. Public expectations were shaped by instant communication, global media, and a growing emphasis on authenticity. The monarchy adapted in measured steps, balancing tradition with gestures of accessibility. Each adjustment reflected an awareness that endurance required flexibility. The later years of Queen Elizabeth II were marked by reflection as much as duty. Her long reign had spanned eras of immense change for recovery, social transformation, technological revolution, and the challenges of modern scrutiny. Through it all, she embodied continuity. Her presence reassured many that the monarchy remained a steady point in a shifting world. Yet even as she continued to perform her role, the institution prepared for transition. Public ceremonies, in this period, carried a dual meaning. They celebrated longevity and service, while quietly acknowledging the passage of time. Jubilees and commemorations drew large crowds and global attention. They reaffirmed the monarchy's symbolic role and its connection to national identity. At the same time, they underscored the reality that leadership would eventually pass to a new generation. The next generation stepped into greater prominence, taking on more visible duties and responsibilities. Their approach reflected lessons learned from past decades. They embraced a degree of openness, engaging with social issues and modern media while maintaining core traditions. This balance aimed to preserve the monarchy's relevance without undermining its heritage. The effort was not without difficulty. Public interest remained intense, and scrutiny remained constant. Challenges persisted in various forms. Public debate about the monarchy's role surfaced periodically, particularly in relation to cost, accountability, and relevance in a democratic society. While support remained strong in many quarters, it was no longer automatic. The institution responded by emphasizing service, continuity, and national unity. Windsor Castle, as both residence and symbol, featured prominently in this narrative. It represented history, but also adaptation. The passing of time inevitably brought moments of loss and change. As senior members of the royal family aged, the question of succession moved from abstract consideration to practical reality. Preparations for transition were conducted with characteristic discretion. The monarchy had experienced such changes before, yet each transition carried unique challenges. The weight of history, expectation, and public attention made the process both ceremonial and deeply personal. When the long-serving sovereign died in 2022, the moment marked the end of an era. The response was immediate and global. Tributes flowed from across the world, reflecting decades of familiarity and continuity. For many, her reign had defined the monarchy itself. Her death created both a sense of loss and a recognition that the institution would continue beyond any individual life. Windsor Castle became a focal point for mourning and remembrance. Crowds gathered, Messages were left, and ceremonies unfolded with solemn precision. The castle's long history provided context for this moment. It had witnessed countless transitions, yet each carried its own emotional weight. The rituals surrounding succession and mourning reinforced continuity while acknowledging change. The new phase of monarchy began under different circumstances than those that had defined earlier decades. Public expectations were shaped by modern values, and the institution faced ongoing questions about its role in contemporary society. Yet it also retained a reservoir of tradition and symbolic authority. The challenge lay in maintaining that authority while adapting to a world that demanded transparency and relevance. In this final outcome, decline and endurance coexisted. The monarchy no longer held the unquestioned influence it once commanded, yet it remained a powerful symbol. Its survival depended on adaptation, careful communication, and the ability to connect with public sentiment. Windsor Castle, unchanged in its physical form, stood as a reminder of both permanence and transformation. The legacy of the House of Windsor in this period was defined by resilience rather than dominance. It had weathered scandal, rivalry, and profound change. It had adapted its image and methods to suit a new era. The cost of this endurance, however, remained embedded in its history, visible in moments of tension, silence, and sacrifice. As the monarchy moved forward, it did so with an awareness shaped by decades of experience. It understood that power, once absolute, had become symbolic. It recognized that relevance required engagement, and it accepted that continuity depended on the willingness to evolve. Windsor Castle remained at the heart of this story. Its walls held memories of triumph and strain alike. It stood as a monument to endurance, but also as a reminder that endurance often demands compromise. The monarchy's final outcome was not a dramatic fall, but a gradual transformation, one that preserved its presence while redefining its meaning. The institution survived, though changed. Its legacy endured, though and within the quiet strength of Windsor's stone walls lay the story of a family and a crown that had navigated the delicate balance between power and humanity, permanence and change. Power, in the story of Windsor Castle, was never simply inherited. It was protected, reshaped, and at times quietly surrendered in order to survive. Across decades of transformation, the House of Windsor learned that authority in the modern age required more than lineage. It required restraint, adaptation, and the willingness to place the institution above the individual again and again. The monarchy preserved its position by mastering the art of continuity. It changed its name to survive war. It sacrificed personal happiness to avoid constitutional crises. It adapted to media scrutiny, public grief, and shifting expectations. Through each challenge, Windsor Castle stood as a steady backdrop, its walls absorbing the weight of decisions that shaped lives and legacy alike. Yet survival carried a cost that rarely appeared in official history. Behind ceremonies and carefully composed appearances were individuals navigating duty that left little room for personal truth. Relationships strained under expectation. Emotions were managed rather than expressed. The crown endured, but not without demanding sacrifices from those who bore it. Some losses were public, others deeply private. Many could never be fully repaired. What the monarchy ultimately won was continuity. It remained a symbol of national identity, tradition, and stability. It adapted enough to endure. It preserved enough to remain recognizable. What it lost was more difficult to measure: intimacy, spontaneity, and the freedom to choose personal paths without consequence were often surrendered in service of the institution. Power and personal fulfillment rarely coexisted easily within its walls. Windsor Castle still stands, its towers unchanged, its presence familiar. Visitors see history, ceremony, and endurance. What they do not see are the silent negotiations, the compromises, and the private reckonings that allowed the institution to continue. The castle holds both triumph and tension within its stones. In the end, the story of Windsor is not one of simple victory or decline. It is the story of a balance maintained at great cost. The crown endured. The institution survived. But the price of preserving power was often paid in moments history remembers only in silence.